Some people can talk for hours and never say anything real. They fill the air with topics, anecdotes, opinions on everything. But the moment a conversation turns inward, the moment someone asks, "What do you actually want?" or "How are you really doing?" something shifts. The energy tightens. A deflection arrives, a joke, a subject change, a glance at the phone. Most people assume this is about being introverted, or private, or just not that kind of person. It isn't. What's actually happening is something far more precise and far more revealing about how a person relates to their own internal world. The common explanation is shyness, or social anxiety, or a preference for surface-level interaction. But those explanations don't account for something strange. The fact that many of the people who struggle most with deep conversation are also highly articulate, socially confident, even extroverted in casual settings. They're not afraid of people. They're afraid of something specific that happens when the conversation shifts depth. What they're actually avoiding isn't connection, it's exposure. Deep conversation requires a person to access their own emotional interior in real time in front of another person. And for some people, that interior is either genuinely unknown to them or known and felt as unsafe to reveal. This video explores why and the behavioral science behind a pattern that almost no one talks about directly. Here's the first thing most people misunderstand about this. When someone avoids a deep conversation, we tend to interpret it as a relational fear. They don't trust you, they're not comfortable, they're protecting their privacy. Sometimes that's true. But research in emotional regulation consistently shows that the more primary driver is something different, a fear of what the person might discover about themselves. Deep conversation is not just social. It is a cognitive and emotional encounter with your own interior. When someone asks you a question like, "What do you actually need in relationships?" you don't just retrieve an answer, you have to go inward, locate something, and translate it into language under social observation. For people who have low interoceptive awareness, a term from neuroscience referring to the capacity to sense and interpret your own internal bodily and emotional states, this process is not just uncomfortable. It's genuinely difficult. The interior is foggy, and being asked to describe what you can't clearly see feels exposing in a way that's hard to explain. This is why some highly emotionally intelligent people can still struggle with depth. They're perceptive about others, but still partially blind to themselves. There's a second layer beneath this, and it operates at the level of identity. For some people, avoiding deep conversation isn't about emotional cowardice. It's about identity preservation. Their self-concept is relatively fixed, coherent, and functional, and deep conversation is a genuine threat to that stability, not because it's hostile, but because it's destabilizing. Psychologist Dan McAdams's research on narrative identity shows that people construct a coherent story of who they are, and that story provides psychological security. Deep conversation threatens to introduce inconsistencies, unwanted self-reflections, or information that doesn't fit the narrative. It's not the other person they fear, it's the edit. This is especially visible in people who are high-performing, identity-driven, or deeply invested in a particular self-image. They can discuss anything in the world, but conversations that turn toward their fears, regrets, doubts, or desires feel like a structural threat. The deeper pattern here is that conversation avoidance can actually be a form of self-concept maintenance. The person is protecting not a secret, but a story. The roots of this pattern often run deeper than adulthood. Attachment research, particularly the work on early relational patterning, shows that the way people relate to emotional depth in conversation reflects, in part, how emotional expression was treated in their earliest environments. People who grew up in households where emotional disclosure was ignored, punished, ridiculed, or simply not modeled, learned a precise behavioral lesson. Emotional expression is not safe, not useful, and possibly a liability, not in a conscious way, in a procedural way, a deep behavioral encoding that becomes the default operating system. This creates what's sometimes called an avoidant attachment style, but the behavioral signature goes beyond relationships. It affects how a person tolerates emotional depth in any context: conversation, introspection, even art or music that is too emotionally direct. What people don't realize is that in many cases, the person who avoids deep conversation didn't decide to. The avoidance was installed long before they had the cognitive capacity to evaluate whether it served them. This is where it becomes physiological. When a conversation turns emotionally deep, for a person with low emotional tolerance, the nervous system responds. Polyvagal theory describes the autonomic nervous system's role in social engagement and threat detection. The ventral vagal state, associated with safety, openness, and genuine social connection, requires a felt sense of psychological safety to remain online. For someone with a history of emotional unavailability, vulnerability being punished, or identity threat, a deep conversation activates a subtler defensive response, not full threat detection, but what is called a neuroception of social risk. The system doesn't trust the depth, and it begins discharging that tension through deflection, humor, topic changes, intellectual abstraction, or simply going blank. The person isn't choosing to disengage. The nervous system is executing a protection protocol that predates their conscious choice. And crucially, this happens fast, faster than the person can name what's occurring. This is why telling someone to just open up is psychologically unhelpful. You are not addressing a decision, you're addressing an encoded behavioral pattern embedded in the threat detection architecture of the nervous system. Because the avoidance is involuntary and often unconscious, most people who experience it have developed a precise set of behavioral compensations to manage it without drawing attention. The most common is intellectualization. The person responds to emotional depth by going conceptual. Asked, "How did that make you feel?" they explain the situation. Asked about a personal fear, they offer a philosophical framework. The conversation stays in the head because the head is safe. The body and the felt sense are bypassed entirely. A second is over-relating, immediately deflecting by saying, "Oh, that's interesting, I read a study about that." The subject pivots outward, the self is removed from the frame, and they are again the observer rather than the observed. A third and subtler pattern is what might be called performative vulnerability. The person shares something personal, but something that is already processed, resolved, and emotionally neutral. It simulates depth without creating exposure. The audience receives the shape of openness without the substance of it. The result is that the person becomes very skilled at appearing emotionally available, while never actually entering depth. They can move through social situations perceived as warm, genuine, even emotionally intelligent, while operating at a permanent slight distance from their own interior. And here is the most uncomfortable part. Many of these people are not aware of how close they actually are. The compensation is so effective that it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like preference. Fearing deep conversation is not a character flaw. It is a behavioral architecture shaped by early experience, encoded in the nervous system, and maintained by compensation patterns so smooth they often pass unnoticed. What changes it is not being pushed to open up. It's developing safety within the self, interoceptive capacity, identity stability, and a nervous system that can remain regulated when depth arrives. That is a slow process, but it begins with the ability to notice what's actually happening in the moment, when you deflect, when you intellectualize, when you offer the processed version of something still alive. The people who notice patterns like these are already doing the harder thing, not performing openness, actually moving toward it. If this reached something in you, take a moment to sit with it. And if you know someone who might recognize themselves here, not to diagnose, but to feel less alone in a pattern they've probably carried for a long time. This video exists for that too.